The air in St. Martin's Parish Hall was thick with the mingled scents of furniture polish, scones, and anticipation. Long trestle tables, draped in crisp white cloths, bore the eclectic donations of the villagers' vintage brooches, silver, teaspoons, a slightly chipped porcelain dog-hand at the far end of the hall. A polished walnut writing desk gleamed beneath the warm lamplight. It was the annual spring charity auction, the sort of event that made the very fabric of village life seem sturdier. Proceeds would go toward repairing the old vicarage roof, and the villagers had turned out in full force, all polished shoes and Sunday smiles, excited to bid on one another's cast-offs. Seated near the front in her usual sky-blue cardigan, Miss Jane Marple regarded the proceedings with polite interest. Her knitting rested in her lap, a neat row of soft gray stitches forming beneath her fingers. Height, however, flitted constantly from item to guest, from whisper to sidelong glance. She was, as always, watching. The auctioneer, Colonel Pembroke, had taken up the gavel with all the solemnity of a man leading troops into battle. Lot 23, he bellowed. Silver photograph frame, Edwardian, with original glass. Bidding began immediately. From the third row, Mrs. Lydia Hartnell, a widow with a fondness for sentimental antiques, raised her hand. Across the aisle, Mr. Arthur Fell, the grocer, countered with a shilling more. A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd. 20 shillings to Mr. Fell, called the colonel. Do I hear 21? The bidding climbed higher as the sun dipped lower outside the windows. The atmosphere was jovial, full of friendly competition and harmless rivalries, till they reached lot 30-2. It was a curious piece, a Victorian music box, lacquered in dark mahogany and inlaid with mother-roof pearl. The tune it played, though few had dared wind, it was said to be a lullaby written by a forgotten composer. This, Colonel Pembroke announced grandly, comes from the estate of the late Mr. Ambrose Glenn. A hush fell. Even Miss Marple's needles paused. Mr. Glenn had died the previous winter peacefully, according to the doctor, though there had been some whispers about his affairs. His niece, Charlotte Glenn, had taken charge of his property, and had donated the music box as part of the auction. Miss Marple, though she rarely indulged in idle gossip, had overheard enough to know that Ambrose Glenn's finances were not quite what they had seemed, and that Charlotte, bright, ambitious, and lately returned from London, was said to be quite determined to make a clean break from the past. Do I have an opening bid? 10 shillings, came a voice from the back. Ted's turned. The speaker was Dr. Marcus Wells, a newcomer to the village, and a man whose presence had sparked no small amount of curiosity. He was tall, with silver at his temples, and a manner that was at once courteous and distant. 15, countered Charlotte Glenn, her eyes cool. A murmur rippled again. It was rare for a donor to bid on her own item. 18, said Mrs. Hartnell, clearly intrigued. 25, said Dr. Wells, without even looking up. Miss Marple glanced between the three of them. Charlotte's lips had thinned slightly. Mrs. Hartnell looked intrigued, but not emotionally invested. Dr. Wells, however, was not bidding for sport. He wanted the music box. 30 shillings to Dr. Wells, said the colonel, going once, twice. 40, said Charlotte, her voice sharp. A pause. Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten now. Her eyes were fixed, not on the music box, but on the players themselves. There was something more here, something personal. The colonel raised an eyebrow. 40 then. To Miss Glenn. 50, said Dr. Wells. Charlotte hesitated. Her lips parted slightly, then closed. Her hand remained in her lap. The gavel fell. Sold to Dr. Wells for 50 shillings. There was a polite smattering of applause, and the auction resumed. But a tension lingered in the air, a thread of unease that not even a tray of lemon cakes could quite dispel. It was Miss Marple who noticed Charlotte slip away not long after. And it was Miss Marple, too, who, though invited to join a card game afterward, chose instead to take a slow walk past the rear of the hall, where the bicycles were kept. There, beneath the shade of the chestnut tree, she found Charlotte Glynn, standing stiffly, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Miss Marple approached with the gentle tread of someone who had no intention of intruding, but always managed to do so anyway. "Such a handsome old box," she said softly. "It must have held some sentimental value for you." Charlotte did not turn. "I don't care about sentiment, Miss Marple." "No?" Charlotte turned in, her face pale in the moonlight. "That man Dr. Wells, he had no right to bid on it. No right at all. Why ever not?" Charlotte opened her mouth, then closed it. "Doesn't matter." But her fingers, clenched at her sides, were trembling. And later that evening, just before midnight, Dr. Marcus Wells was found dead in the study of his rented cottage, the music box shattered at his feet. By morning, St. Martin's was humming not with birdsong or the usual clatter of milk deliveries, but with gossip sharp enough to slice through bread. News of Dr. Marcus Wells's death had traveled at lightning speed. It had begun, as such things often did, with young Thomas Briggs, the baker's apprentice, who had been dispatched to deliver bread to the doctor's cottage and returned wide and pale, insisting that no one had answered the door and that the window beside it had been smashed in with something nasty. By 8 o'clock, Constable Greaves had been summoned, and by 1:30, Mrs. Green, the postmistress, was already retelling the story twice removed and thoroughly embroidered to Mrs. Abernathy at the grocer's, complete with details about blood on the piano keys and a missing surgical scalpel, neither of which had yet been confirmed. Miss Marple, for her part, had risen early, as she always did, and was trimming a lavender bush when Inspector Cray of the County Constabulary arrived at her gate. A polite, fair-haired man in his 40s, Cray had known Miss Marple long enough to know her insight was not to be underestimated, though he never said so aloud in front of other officers. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, lifting his hat. "Terrible business at Dr. Wells's place." She snipped a dry sprig with a faint smile. "Indeed, Inspector? A very sad thing. I gather it was discovered just after dawn." Cray nodded. "Window broken. Signs of a struggle. The place was in disarray. And this," he paused, tugging gently at his collar. "This wasn't burglary. His wallet was on the desk, money untouched." "In the music box?" she asked, dusting her gloves together. "Shattered." Cray looked puzzled. "Odd thing. Really, most of the glass shards were embedded in the carpet near the hearth, as if it had been smashed intentionally." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Ah, yes, the music box." She peered up at him over her spectacles. "Do you know, Inspector, I found that bidding episode last night quite out of character. Not the sort of village jostling one expects over teacups and doilies. There was tension." Cray gave her a measured look. "You noticed it too, then?" She nodded. "And I do so dislike tension, Inspector. It rarely ends tidily." Cray smiled faintly. "I've arranged to speak with Miss Charlotte Glynn later this morning. She was one of the last to see him. Seemed rather worked up, according to the vicar's wife." "Oh yes," said Miss Marple, turning to gather her basket. Charlotte was most definitely not pleased to see that music box in Dr. Wells's possession. Cray raised an eyebrow. "Do you think she's capable of this sort of thing?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Oh, my dear Inspector, I've found it's not always a question of capable, but of pushed. People do dreadful things when they believe they're protecting something or someone they care about." He made a thoughtful sound, then tipped his hat again. "As always, I appreciate your thoughts. I'll keep you informed." Miss Marple watched him go, then turned to the lavender once more, her expression thoughtful. It was not the first time Death had disturbed the calm routines of St. Martin's, but it was rare that the victim had been such an outsider by midday. The tea room at the Bluebell Inn was filled with murmurs over plates of seed cake and slices of pork pie. The locals gathered as if drawn by instinct, seating themselves in pairs and trios, their conversations overlapping in a fugue of speculation. "I heard he was poisoned," muttered Mrs. Hartnell, dabbing at her mouth, slumped right over that dreadful music box. "Oh, no, no," countered Mr. Hargrove, the churchwarden. "He was attacked with something heavy. It's always blunt force, you know. Very English." "Do you think it was a robbery gone wrong?" asked the vicar's wife, glancing around theatrically. "I mean, he was a stranger here." "That box," Lydia Hartnell murmured again, frowning into her tea. "It's the box. He wanted it too badly." You saw how Charlotte reacted. Miss Marple entered just as this last remark was uttered. She accepted her usual table in the corner with a nod, and Miss Goff, the nervous young waitress, hurried to bring her a cup of Earl Grey and a currant bun. Miss Marple listened quietly, knitting in her lap once more. Her needles clacked gently, a quiet counterpoint to the more animated clatter of silverware and gossip. She noted several things as she sipped her tea. Charlotte had not been seen all morning. Dr. Wells had made no real social efforts during his stay. His manner was polite but aloof, and yet, when it came time to bid on that music box, he had cared deeply. But why? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where clouds had begun to gather above the green. She thought of something Charlotte had said the night before. He had no right to bid on it. I didn't want him to have it. Not it was mine, but he had no right. That suggested something else. Ownership, knowledge, a secret. Miss Marple finished her tea. Her thoughts crystallized around one possibility. What if the music box, so unassuming and sentimental, had been more than just a decorative trinket? What if it had held something of value, not visible to the naked eye? Perhaps, just perhaps, Dr. Wells hadn't been bidding on the music box at all, but on what was inside it. Inspector Cray had a certain approach to investigations, neat, linear, and orderly. He preferred clear motives, confessions that followed confrontation, and suspects who crumbled under the pressure of a direct question. Unfortunately for him, village crimes were rarely so obliging. And St. Martin's, with its lace curtains and impeccable lawns, had a tendency to hide its secrets under layers of respectability and jam-dash making. It was nearing noon when Cray arrived at Charlotte Glenn's cottage, a neat white structure on the edge of the village with a climbing rose threatening to overtake the porch. He was greeted not by Charlotte, but by her housekeeper, a stout, efficient woman named Mrs. Phelps, who ushered him into the drawing room with a quick, tight-lipped nod. Charlotte entered moments later, composed but paler than the day before. She wore a charcoal gray blouse and skirt, and her hair was pinned with the precision of someone desperately trying to keep control. "Inspector," Ree said, "I imagine you've come about Dr. Wells." Cray offered a brief nod. "I'm sorry to bring more unpleasantness, Miss Glenn, but yes, I understand you knew him." Charlotte moved to the window, her back straight. "Not well. He arrived in the village just a few months ago. I think he rented the old Rohan cottage. Yet you both bid rather fiercely on that music box last night." A pause. Charlotte's hand tightened on the windowsill. "It belonged to my uncle." "Yes, I was told that," Cray said, studying her. "But it seemed to mean more than simple sentiment." Charlotte turned to face him. "I didn't want him to have it." "Why not?" "Because he didn't deserve it." Cray raised a brow. "Miss Glenn, I must be blunt. Were you and Dr. Wells, how shall I say, previously acquainted before he came to St. Martin's?" Charlotte's lips pressed into a line. She looked away again. "Yes." Cray leaned forward slightly. "I see. And what was the nature of that acquaintance?" Charlotte's voice dropped. was once engaged to my sister. There was a long silence. Cray sat back. Your sister? She died 2 years ago, in Bath. Charlotte spoke without emotion now, as though reciting facts from a ledger. After the engagement ended, he broke her heart, left her quite. Suddenly, there was a scandal. Letters. He denied everything. Cray blinked. He never told anyone he'd moved to the village. I didn't think it would matter, she said quietly. He acted as though we were strangers, so I played along, but you bid against him for the music box. Charlotte's chin lifted slightly. Because it was mine. I inherited it. And I had a feeling he was after more than just a pretty tune. Cray's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? She hesitated. Before he left my sister, there were rumors that he was using her to get at my Uncle Ambrose. Uncle Ambrose had quite a few rare items, collectibles. He was eccentric, but meticulous. We always believed he had hidden things of value, though nothing was ever found after his death. And you think Dr. Wells knew that? I think he believed the music box might be one of those things. Cray made a note. Was the box examined before the auction? Charlotte shook her head. No, it was part of a set of donations. I never thought. ... Double quotes. She trailed off. I should have checked. Cray studied her in silence. Where were you after the auction ended? Charlotte's voice was flat. Here, I came straight home. Can anyone confirm that? She blinked. Mrs. Phelps went to bed early. I suppose not. Cray closed his notebook. Thank you, Miss Glenn. That will be all for now. As he left, Charlotte returned to the window, her eyes unfocused. She hadn't lied. Not really, but there was more to her story. And Cray could feel it pressing at the edges. Meanwhile, across the village green, Miss Marple sat quietly in the reading nook of Mrs. Bantry's sunroom, her knitting in hand and her attention only half on the click of the needles. Everyone saying it was Charlotte, Mrs. Bantry said dramatically. You know how people talk. They always want it to be someone they know, or someone they don't like. Miss Marple nodded absently. Yes, dear. And if we were to go by village whispers, I dare say half the parish would be locked away before tea time. Mrs. Bantry sipped her sherry. But you don't think she did it? Miss Marple's eyes glinted. No, I don't. Charlotte Glenn has a temper, certainly. But I don't think she's the sort who smashes music boxes in the dead of night. She would have confronted him, not crept about in shadows. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. Then who? Miss Marple gave a mild shrug. Well, that depends. You. See, I've always believed that when a person kills, there's more than just anger involved. There's something they feel they must protect, a reputation, a secret, a possession, or perhaps something they feared being exposed. Mrs. Bantry blinked. So it wasn't about the box. Oh no, Miss Marple said gently. It was about what the box represented. At that very moment, across the village, Constable Greaves was returning from Dr. Wells's cottage with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside were the broken remains of the music box. The delicate gears bent and twisted. The lacquered wood split clean in two, and nestled between the fragments, barely visible, was a thin slip of yellowed parchment, tucked between the false bottom. In the velvet lining, something written in Ambrose Glenn's own hand, a list of names. Inspector Cray stood in the dim back room of the station, the parcel laid open on the worn desk in front of him. The remains of the music box had been carefully laid out, each splinter and cog examined, catalogued, and set aside with the reverence of a fragile clue. But it was the slip of parchment, creased, brittle, and nearly translucent, that commanded his full attention. 5 names, written in a tight, spidery hand. Francis Delaney, George Partridge, Eleanor Vale, M. Wells, C. Glenn. The last 2 names required no speculation. The others, however, were unfamiliar, unsettling. Cray traced the initials with the end of his pencil, lips pressed in a thin line. "Why would Ambrose Glenn write this?" he muttered. "And what does it have to do with the doctor's murder?" Before he could follow the thought further, the door creaked open and Constable Greaves entered, clutching a file folder and looking mildly winded. "I've been going through the old village archives, sir. Found something that might be related." Cray turned. "Let's see." Greaves laid the folder down and opened it. Inside were photocopies of parish records, dated some 20 years earlier. There was a land dispute, the constable explained. Small matter, mostly forgotten some property Ambrose Glenn inherited from his uncle. A small cottage on the outskirts of the woods, just past the East Hollow. Turned out 5 people had claimed to it, or believed they did. Glenn settled it quietly, out of court. But the names, Greaves pointed to the document. Cray's eyes moved down the list. Francis Delaney, George Partridge, Eleanor Vale, the same 3 names. And Wells, he asked. Greaves scratched the back of his neck. Didn't show up in the case file, but I did find something odd. Marcus Wells once practiced in Bath, resigned his position at the hospital there under a bit of a cloud. No charges, but whispers. Something about misappropriation of estate property after a patient died. Cray's jaw tightened. And see, Glenn Charlotte ties her to this mess, too. She would have been just a teenager at the time, Greaves offered. Probably not involved. Cray stared at the names again, unless she knew something back then. Something she's kept hidden. He leaned back in his chair, frowning. The music box, the list, the pastel tangled like brambles around this death. He needed to find out what had happened 20 years ago. And fast. Meanwhile, at the corner table of the Blue Bill Inn, Miss Marple poured a second cup of tea with her usual quiet grace. Opposite her sat Reverend Thomas Lindley, a kind-faced man whose primary vices were excessive sugar in his tea and an unfortunate tendency to talk too much when nervous. "I've been thinking," he said, tapping his teaspoon against the side of his cup, "about Dr. Wells. You know, he came to one of our men's fellowship evenings last month. Didn't say much, of course, but, well, he asked rather pointed questions." "Oh," Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "About what, precisely?" "History," the Reverend said. "Nothing dramatic, really. Something about old land deeds and records. Curious chap. I told him everything I knew, which isn't much, I'm afraid. Most of those records are long lost or misfiled." Miss Marple's knitting needles had stilled again. "Did he mention the name Ambrose Glenn?" "Oh, yes," the vicar replied. "Said he was doing research on the family." "Odd. Really, he said it was for a book, but I didn't quite believe him." "No," Miss Marple murmured. "I imagine it wasn't a book at all." Her thoughts turned again to the auction, to the intensity in Wells's gaze, the suppressed fury in Charlotte's, and to the curious thing about the pellist, something unspoken yet bubbling beneath the surface. Names written down by a dying man, perhaps a final ledger of guilt. But guilt from what? That evening, the village green was hushed under a low sky, the clouds hanging heavy with the promise of rain. Inside Charlotte Glenn's cottage, a fire crackled weakly in the hearth as she stood at her writing desk, hands resting on the edge, her posture rigid. She stared down at an old photograph, the edges worn, the image slightly faded. 5 figures stood in front of a stone building, young, laughing, unaware of what lay ahead. Ambrose Glenn stood at the back, his expression serious even then. And beside him, Francis, George, Eleanor, Marcus, and just barely visible in the corner Charlotte herself, a mere slip of a girl. She hadn't thought of that day in years, not since the fire, not since the lies began. A knock at the door broke the silence. Charlotte stiffened, hastily tucking the photo into a drawer before answering it. It was Miss Marple. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said sweetly. "Only I've been thinking about Ambrose's music box." I wondered if we might talk a little more. Charlotte hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. I don't know how much help I can be. Oh, I think you know more than most, Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm. And I think it's been weighing on you. Quite heavily, in fact. Charlotte said nothing. Miss Marple settled into a chair by the fire and took out her knitting. You see, I've always found that secret-souled secrets especially have a way of coming up like weeds in the spring. And no matter how carefully they're buried, something always grows from them. Charlotte turned away. You have no idea what you're talking about? Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly. Or perhaps I know enough to see that whatever happened between your uncle and those other names, Francis, George, Eleanor, was never properly resolved. And now one of them is dead. Charlotte's knuckles whitened against the windowsill. I tried to forget. Yes, Miss Marple said gently, but someone else didn't. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. A low warning from the gathering dark dot, and across the village, in the locked archives of the old rectory, Constable Greaves pushed open a heavy drawer and found what he'd been searching for, a yellowed file marked Rowan Cottage Transfer Dispute. He pulled it free, flipped it open, and froze. Inside was a handwritten letter, dated March 1911, signed Ambrose Glynn, and addressed to his solicitor, with one chilling line underlined. Should anything happen to me, the music box holds the truth. The next morning dawned cool and damp, the rain having come and gone in the night, leaving behind puddles that mirrored the gray sky. In St. Martin's, the usual rhythm of village life continued. Children off to school, the clatter of milk, bottles, dogs barking in gardens, but underneath it all was a current of tension. Subtle but insistent, Miss Marple, seated beneath the bay window in her sitting room, was carefully threading a new skein of wool. The needles lay untouched on the armrest beside her. She had been thinking for some time now, retracing the steps not only of the past few days, but of years long buried. There was a pattern emerging, fragmentary, half-glimpsed, like a piece of lace turned wrong side out. The names, the photograph. The letter Constable Greaves had just brought to Inspector Crayall pointed to something calculated, something long in the making. There was, she felt, a buried story, and someone had just begun to dig it up at the police station. Inspector Cray sat at his desk, the letter from Ambrose Glynn spread out before him. The handwriting, though old-fashioned, was unmistakably precise. Should anything happen to me, the music box holds the truth. The words were plain, yet heavy with implication. Cray tapped his pencil on the edge of the desk, frowning. This wasn't a mere collector's note or the whimsical musings of an eccentric man. It was deliberate. Greaves, he said suddenly. The constable looked up from across the room. I want you to track down those other 3 names from the list: Delaney, Kate Partridge, and Vale. Find out if they're still living or if they've had any family nearby. I want addresses, known associates, anything you can get. Greaves nodded. Right away, sir. Cray glanced again at the list, the edges of the parchment curling slightly with H.M. Wells. C. Glynn, that these two had ended up in St. Martin's after so many years could not be chance. Something had drawn them back, and now Wells was dead. Cray leaned back, letting the pieces rattle in his head. Why come back now? What was hidden in that past that someone would kill to protect? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself at the churchyard, ostensibly to check on the flowering bulbs she and the vicar's wife had planted weeks earlier. But her path curved quite naturally, she would say, toward the old section near the west wall, where moss clung to the names of the dead and time had softened the edges of grief. There she found the grave of Eleanor Vale. The stone was modest. Eleanor M. Vale, 1890 to 1923. Faithful daughter and devoted sister, Miss Marple stood quietly for a moment. Her eyes narrowed. Eleanor was the only woman among the 5 names. dead for over 2 decades. And yet her name had remained on Ambrose's list, written with the same urgency as the others. Why include the dead? Unless... She turned slowly, her eyes sweeping across the other headstones, thinking. 5 names. 1 already long dead. 1 newly sodat left 3. And 2 of them, she suspected, had not been idle these past weeks. In the early twilight, Inspector Cray stepped through the narrow hallway of Rohan Cottage once more. The constable had arranged for the door to be resecured, but Cray had requested another search. Something about the place gnawed at him. The room where Dr. Wells had died was still and cold, the fire long extinguished. The smashed music box was gone, but the silence it had left remained. Cray crossed to the writing desk, the one place not in disarray. The drawer slid open smoothly, and inside he found a single notebook, leather-bound, unmarked. He hesitated, then opened it. The first few pages were blank, but halfway through he found careful notes, descriptions of local properties, names, land transfers, old debts, and, in Wells's meticulous script, Ambrose Glenn hid the truth. Not gold, not jewels, something older, a record the others know. Cray turned a page, found a sketch of the music box, its dimensions annotated in detail, and below it, hidden compartment, verified. Charlotte suspected, but did not investigate. She doesn't know what was inside. Cray closed the notebook slowly. Sowles had been looking for something all along, and he had found it. But someone had found him first, that same evening, into the dim lamplight of her own sitting room. Miss Marple sat with her friend, Mrs. Bantry. They had been discussing the curious nature of secrets. It's the kind of thing, you know, Mrs. Bantry said, pouring more tea, that starts out quite small. One person covers for another. Someone writes a letter and never sends it. Mistake, a lie, and then years later, it all comes bubbling back. Quite right, Miss Marple murmured, her expression distant. She picked up her knitting, but the needles stayed still. There's something quite ancient about this one, she said at last. Not just the usual village bitterness or a love gone wrong. No, this feels older, a debt that was never paid. Mrs. Bantry blinked. Debt. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. Oh, not necessarily of money. There are debts of silence, of loyalty, and sometimes debts of guilt. Outside, the wind stirred in the hedges. Somewhere far off, a church bell chimed the hour. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly over the wool in her lap. Someone came back to settle something, we said quietly, and someone else was determined they wouldn't. That night, in a modest brick house 2 villages over, a man named George Partridge stood in his workshop, staring at the photograph in his hand. 5 friends, 1 dead by time, 1 dead by murder. He folded the photo with shaking fingers and slipped it into a drawer, locking it with a soft click. Then he turned out the light. Morning mist clung to the hedgerows as St. Martin's slowly roused to another day. The dew lay thick on the village green, and the first faint warmth of spring sunlight glinted off the windows of the Bluebell Inn. But for all its usual charm, there was a hush in the air, kind of collective holding of breath. News of Dr. Wells's death had passed beyond curiosity now. The villagers no longer whispered out of excitement, but from Annie's.d. post office. Mrs. Green barely noticed the arrival of her early letters, and Mr. Hargrove forgot to wind the church clock. Something had shifted. A past, long buried, was stirring again. Miss Marple, wrapped in a soft gray shawl, took her morning constitutional along the path leading from the church to the East Hollow Woods. It was a quiet route, one she often preferred when thinking, and she walked with unhurried steps, serving the frost curling along the edges of the bracken. She had come not only to clear her thoughts, but to see a place seldom spoken of these days, Rowan Cottage's original boundary. The property, now rented by the late Dr. Wells, had once extended into the hollow itself until Ambrose Glenn had sold off a portion decades ago in a mysterious, hastily arranged transaction, and somewhere near the tree line stood the remains of an old outbuilding rumored to have been a gamekeeper's shelter. So Miss Marple suspected it had once served quite a different purpose. She paused at a slight rise where the ground dipped toward the tree roots, overgrown with ivy and moss. Stones jutted up at odd angles, half consumed by time. A chimney, crumbled and useless, leaned against the earth like a broken mast. She stood there for some time, listening. The woods were quiet, too quiet, as though they, too, remembered. At the station, Inspector Cray reviewed Constable Greaves's latest report. "George Partridge is living in Little Matherby," Greaves said, tapping the file. "Runs a repair shop now. Kept his head down. Never married." Cray nodded, scanning the details. "And the other Francis Delaney, still tracking him. Might have immigrated years ago. There's no firm trace yet. Vale's death is on record. Consumption, 1,923. Nothing suspicious. But odd that Glenn would still include her name." Cray closed the file and steepled his fingers. "This wasn't just about property, Greaves. There's an emotional undercurrent. Glenn didn't write that list for legal reasons. He wrote it because of something that happened, something he felt couldn't be forgotten." Greaves hesitated. "Sir, do you think Charlotte knows what it was?" "I think," Cray said slowly, "she knows part of it. But there's still a piece missing." He rose, reaching for his coat. "I'm going to speak with Mr. Partridge." It was a short drive to Little Matherby, and Cray found George Partridge, exactly as described, reserved, slow-moving, the quiet watchfulness of a man who had grown used to being left alone. His workshop was tidy, lined with shelves of clock parts, radio valves, and carefully labeled drawers. When Cray entered, George didn't look up immediately. He was polishing a brass carriage clock. "You've come about Marcus," he said at last. Cray paused. "You knew him, then?" Partridge gave a dry laugh. "Course I didn't. You don't forget people you made pacts with, even when you want to." Cray approached the workbench slowly. "What kind of pact?" Partridge put down the cloth and met his gaze. "The sort that holds for a long time until someone decides it's no longer convenient." "Ambrose Glenn?" Cray asked. Another pause. "We were young," George said finally. "Started as a venture. Something harmless. Ambrose had idea schemes. Really? We each invested something, but then things changed." Cray kept his voice calm. "How?" "There was a visitor. A man who came from London. We never knew his real name. Said he had a map, old property titles. Talked about treasure smuggling routes, even. Said the land behind the cottage had value." "And you believed him?" George's face tightened. "We were fools, but Ambrose he wasn't. He got nervous, said it had gone too far, told us to forget it. But by then, someone had already made copies of the documents, letters. Wells, most likely, always had a taste for leverage." Cray absorbed this in silence. "Was that what the music box was for?" he asked finally. George gave a short nod. "Ambrose kept things hidden. Records, agreements, threats. He was a cautious man, paranoid even. Said if anything ever happened to him, the box would speak." Cray leaned forward. "So who had the most to lose, if it did?" George looked at him evenly. "All of us." That evening, Charlotte Glenn sat alone in her uncle's study. Since his passing, she had kept the room locked partly from sentiment, partly because she hadn't yet had the heart to sort through it. But now, drawn by the threads unraveling around her, she had opened the door. Dust hovered in the slanting light. Books lined the walls, and on the large oak desk lay a single locked drawer she had never been able to open till now. She held the music box's winding key in her hand. It had been returned to her, cracked but intact. The box itself was destroyed, but the key. Ambrose had always told her it was a key to more than music. She slid it into the desk's hidden lock. A soft click echoed through the room. Inside, yellowed pages, maps, and a faded envelope. She pulled it free, her breath catching as she read the handwriting dot to be opened only if the past returns. As she unfolded the letter, her hand trembled. Outside, the wind rose through the branches, and far off, a fox's cry echoed in the hollow. Back at Miss Marple's cottage, the kettle whistled gently as she laid out her evening tray. She moved with quiet purpose, her face thoughtful. The circle was closing, but not neatly. No. This would not be a story of clean justice and tidy confessions. This would be a story of buried truths. Reluctant reckonings and debts, some paid in silence, others in blood. And it wasn't finished yet. The letter was brittle in Charlotte's hands, the paper thin with age, and the ink faded to a sepia brown. She read it once, then again, slower, each word anchoring itself deeper into her mind. My dearest Charlotte, if you are reading this, then something has stirred the ashes of what we buried long ago. You must understand, I did what I thought was right, but right and lawful are not always the same. There was a ledger, a record of payments, made illegal payments, made in silence, to silence others. I kept it, not for leverage, but for penance. The music box was my seal. If the truth ever needed to be unearthed, it would start there. Be cautious of the others. Not all are content with the past staying buried. And secrets, once unearthed, are rarely gentle in what they take. Yours in trust, Ambrose. Charlotte sat back, her pulse a cold, steady thrum beneath her skin. The letter said nothing overtly damning, yet between the lines were the sharp edges of something far more dangerous. Ledger, payments, silence. It wasn't just about land or trinkets. It was about complicity. She reached for the stack of documents that had been hidden in the desk, fragments of receipts, hand-drawn maps, and a faded journal bearing the initials F.D. Francis Delaney, a name she hadn't heard aloud in 20 years. That same evening, Inspector Cray returned to the station, his coat damp from a spring drizzle and his mood darker still. Greaves met him at the door, holding a telegram in one hand and a file in the other. News from the Foreign Office, the constable said. Delaney's last known address was in Lisbon, but there's no record of departure from the UK in the 2E. Last 15 years. And he handed over the file. We found something else. Cray opened the folder and stared at the contents. A faded copy of an inquest. Year 1923. Name Eleanor Vale. Cause of death respiratory failure. A what? Caught his attention was a brief notation in the corner. It's handwritten and barely legible. Witness Marcus Wells. He frowned. I thought he wasn't in the village until this year. Greaves shrugged. Maybe he wasn't, but he was present at the inquest. There's no record explaining why. Cray's brow furrowed. What happened to Eleanor Vale? Officially, died after a prolonged illness. But there were whispers in the parish record. Talk of something found on her property documents, possibly something connected to Glenn. Cray rubbed his temple. This ledger of Ambrose's, it must have tied them all together. Vale found it, or part of it, and Wells saw something he shouldn't, and now he's dead. Cray's jaw set. Yes, which means someone else is still watching. The next morning, Miss Marple found herself once again in the company of Reverend Linley, who had invited her to look through the church's older registers and property records ostensibly to assist with the local history week, though both of them knew it was for something more. They sat at a long table in the vestry. Yellowing papers spread before them like the pages of some long-forgotten book. There's something strange about this entry here, Linley said, pointing to a record dated 1901. It's transfer of church land to Ambrose Glenwright, up to the edge of East Hollow. No explanation. Had the records been amended in a different hand 20 years later? Miss Marple peered over her spectacles. That would be shortly after Eleanor Vale died, wouldn't it? He nodded. Yes. And look, this margin note. Boundary dispute settled, record sealed. No details. No names. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. When things are sealed in a village like ours, Reverend, it usually means the truth was deemed too inconvenient. She tapped her knitting needle against the page thoughtfully. There was something buried at East Hollow. Not just a metaphor, something real. I think Ambrose knew it, and someone else found out. Meanwhile, Charlotte stood before the hearth. In her drawing room, the documents spread across the carpet in neat rows. The faded journal of Francis Delaney revealed little at first cryptic notes. Accounts of late-night meetings, mentions of an unnamed benefactor. But one entry stood out. W. is growing restless. He wants proof, lest or else he threatens. Exposure. Partridge says it's bluster. I'm not so sure. The page was dated just months before Ambrose Glenn had abruptly cut ties with the others. Charlotte's stomach turned. Wells had been holding leverage for decades. Hey, and then, like a crow returning to the scene of an old feast, he had come back to claim what he believed was owed, but someone had stopped him. And now, Charlotte understood why. There was more than shame. In those names, there was guilt. That afternoon, Inspector Cray returned to Miss Marple's cottage, his coat buttoned high and his face drawn. You were right, he said, without preamble. It wasn't about money, or even revenge. It was about a secret held between 5 people and the slow collapse of trust. Miss Marple motioned for him to sit. Did Charlotte know? She knows now, he said, and she's frightened. Not for herself, I think, but for what happens. Next, Miss Marple poured tea with her usual grace. It's an old story, Inspector. A pact made, a silence kept, and then broken. And once broken, someone always feels they must act before the others do. Cray exhaled. So, who did it? Miss Marple's eyes were calm. You'll have your answer soon enough. But first task, yourself, this, who had nothing to gain by killing Dr. Wells, and everything to lose if the truth came out. Cray sat back, the weight of it settling on his shoulders. Outside, the sky was darkening once more, the clouds thick with spring rain, and somewhere beyond the village, in a quiet cottage behind shuttered windows, a second body waited to be found. It was Mrs. Bantry who first noticed the absence. Not a person, at first, but a presence. George Partridge's workshop, usually opened by 8, with the whir of radios and the ticking of clocks spilling faintly into the lane, remained shuttered. By noon, the blinds were still drawn. No whiff of soldering smoke curled from the chimney. No sign of life at all. Odd, she told Miss Marple over tea that afternoon. He's never missed a day, not in years. My husband once broke a carriage clock in the middle of Advent, and George fixed it before the mince pies were cold. Quite dependable. Miss Marple, ever careful with her expressions, gave only a faint nod, though her hands stilled over her knitting. She had been expecting something, though not this. Not yet. She rose with the quietness of someone who knew they would be walking toward unpleasant truth. The police broke in just after 4. George Partridge's house was small and neat. Everything in its place. Tea still sat in the pot on the stove. The day's newspaper remained folded on the table. But there was no sign of a struggle. No upturned chairs, no broken glass, except in the workshop. There, amid the tools and tidy chaos of gears and wires, George lay slumped beside his bench, one hand resting on the floor, the other curled near his chest. His spectacles had slipped askew, one lens cracked. Inspector Cray arrived minutes later, jaw tight, jaw set. Natural causes. Greaves asked hesitantly, peering over his shoulder. Cray glanced at the constable. "We'll wait for the coroner, but I doubt it. There's no sign of violence, but something about this feels deliberate." He moved to the bench and saw a sheet of paper resting beside the half-polished brass clock. On it, in a tight, shaking hand, were 5 words. "I didn't kill Marcus Wells." Back in her parlor, Miss Marple sipped her tea in silence. She had not gone to the scene. Her presence was not required, nor requested, but the news had already reached her. By the time the kettle boiled, Mrs. Bantry had rushed back from the grocer, breathless and wide-eyed, and related in a flurry of words. Miss Marple had simply nodded. She had been expecting a second silence. Not all deaths announced themselves in shouts. Some arrive in whispers, disguised as regret. She sat very still, watching the fading daylight catch on the rosebud china. Her thoughts turned not to George Partridge, but to the one name that remained, Francis Delaney, the only member of the old group still unaccounted for. No, not unaccounted for, she thought. Merely hidden. Inspector Cray read the note 3 times, then set it gently into an evidence sleeve. The room had the air of something receding, like an echo folding into itself. There was no energy of crime here, no heat of sudden anger or panic, just exhaustion. He turned to Greaves. "What do we have on Partridge's last movements?" "Not much," the constable replied. "He closed up the workshop early yesterday. No visitors recorded. One neighbor thinks she saw him walking in the direction of the woods after dark." Cray frowned. "East Hollow." Greaves nodded. Cray looked at the workbench once more, then walked to the narrow drawer beneath it. Inside, among polishing cloths and oil canisters, was a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Cray unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a journal. Not Partridge's, but Ambrose Glenn's. The final entry was dated the week before his death. Wells sent another letter, claims to know everything. "I don't doubt him, he always did see too much. I've hidden what I could. The box will protect the rest. If they come for it, they'll come for me. Charlotte must never see the ledger. It's not guilt. She'd carried shame." Cray closed the journal slowly. This wasn't just the aftermath of a pact gone wrong. It was the unraveling of a circle once bound by secrecy, now collapsing under the weight of memory. That evening, Miss Marple received a visit. Charlotte Glenn stood at her door, pale and drawn, the envelope still clutched in one hand. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. Miss Marple stepped aside with a gentle nod. "Come in, dear. The kettle's still warm." They sat in the parlor, lamplight softening the edges of the dusk. Charlotte unfolded the letter again, laying it between them like an offering. "I read it 3 times. I still don't understand what he meant. Ambrose always seemed so careful." "It was," Miss Marple said softly. "But care, my dear, does not prevent consequence." Charlotte's eyes glistened. "You think George killed Dr. Wells?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, I think George was trying to stop something, or perhaps trying to atone for it." She tapped the letter. "Your uncle hid more than a ledger. He hid the truth about what happened at East Hollow. Can the others, they each chose silence in their own way. But Marcus Wells came back not just for what he believed was his, but to expose what they had all agreed to forget." Charlotte's breath caught. "So George was afraid," Miss Marple finished. "What would happen if that truth reached light?" There was a long pause. "I keep thinking," Charlotte whispered, "maybe if I hadn't donated the box." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "That only hastened what was already stirring. It's things, Miss Glenn. They find their way to the surface, eventually." Outside, the night had fallen. The wind moved in the trees like a hush, and somewhere down the lane, a church bell tolled 7 times. A second silence had fallen over St. Martin's, but Miss Marple knew there was still one voice unaccounted for. one name remaining, Frances Delaney. And if she was right, he was already closer than they realized. The storm that had threatened all afternoon finally arrived in the dark hours before dawn. Rain lashed against the cottage roofs of St. Martin's, and the wind keened through chimney pots with an eerie, keening wail. It was the sort of weather that sent even the nosiest villagers indoors and left the roads slick and empty. But at the edge of the village, a single lantern bobbed through the downpour, winding along the overgrown path toward the ruins at East Hollow. Miss Marple sat upright in her chair, the letter from Ambrose Glenn still open on the table beside her. She had not gone to bed. Sleep, she had long ago decided, was of little use when one felt the wind of truth about to shift. The moment had arrived. It was Inspector Cray who brought the news the next morning. Frances Delaney's been found. He stood at Miss Marple's threshold, coat dripping, face grim. Behind him, the village was cloaked in a strange stillness, as if the rain had washed the last color from its stones. "I'd assumed he was abroad," he said, "but he wasn't. He's been here, living under the name Frederick Dean, rented a converted barn just north of Gorse Lane, moved in 6 weeks ago." Miss Marple's eyes were clear. "And let me guess, he kept to himself, paid in cash, no close neighbors." Craig gave a tight nod. "Exactly. I spoke to him. He claims he came back because of a letter. Said he received it anonymously." Miss Marple murmured, like a bell tolling. Cray stepped inside, lowering his voice. He didn't deny knowing Wells or Partridge, but he insists he had no contact with either since returning. Said he only watched. Said he was waiting for something to happen. And it did. Cray exhaled slowly. He won't admit to anything, but I get the sense he knows far more than he'll say. And he had something with him. Something Wells wanted. Miss Marple tilted her head. "The ledger, possibly," Cray said. "But it wasn't with him when we searched the cottage." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "Then I suspect he's hidden it. Somewhere meaningful. Something symbolic. These men, they dealt in symbols." Cray glanced at her. "Do you believe he's our killer?" "No," she said, quite calmly. "I believe he's our last witness." Delaney, tall, spare, and ghost-like after years of absence, sat alone in the interview room at the station, his hands folded neatly on the table. He bore the strange, hollow dignity of a man who had spent too long looking backward. Cray entered with deliberate quiet. "You returned because of the music box," he said. Delaney nodded slowly. "It was always going to be the music box." "Why?" Cray asked. Delaney's voice was hoarse. "Because that's where Ambrose said the truth would begin." "Not end. Begin." Cray said. "Then tell me, what happened 20 years ago?" Delaney looked at his hands. "There was a parcel of land," he said. "East Hollow. Ambrose found something there. A hoard, perhaps. Not gold, documents, deeds, coins. Something valuable. But instead of reporting it, we kept it quiet. Split it between us." Wells said he'd handled the paperwork. He was clever. Too clever. He swallowed. "Then Eleanor found out. She wasn't part of the plan. She wanted us to return everything. She threatened to speak to the papers. And she died." Delaney nodded once. "Officially, it was illness, but she was left alone, too long, without care. Okay, she didn't die by poison or by hand, but we let her die. We let her die to keep a secret intact." Cray was silent for a long moment. "And Wells?" he asked. He wanted to expose it now. Thought enough time had passed that we should pay, okay? But not out of nobility, no. He wanted control. Again, Delaney's hands curled slightly. "So I watched. I watched him provoke Charlotte. I saw George grow frightened. I waited." Cray leaned forward. "And when Wells died, I knew someone had acted. And then George followed, and I was next. You were afraid. Delaney looked up, and his eyes were full of something that wasn't quite fear. Not afraid, just tired. I've carried the silence for so long, forgot how to speak without it. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had taken a different path that morning, one lined with violets and wet gravel, toward the chapel ruins behind East Hollow. She carried no lantern, no notebook, only a small trowel and a satchel tucked over one arm. She knew what she was looking for. The ledger, yes, but more than that, the intent behind its hiding. She found it beneath a loose stone in the chapel wall, dry in its oilskin wrapped out inside, the full record, receipts of sale, split shares. A note in Wells's hand detailing how and when he had planned to expose the others. And beneath it all, the smallest page of them all, Eleanor's letter. Miss Marple read the final words of a woman who had tried to do the right thing and had been met with silence. Then she folded the ledger close. Some truths must be spoken, others must be understood. Later that evening, as twilight dimmed the corners of the village, Miss Marple met Inspector Cray beneath the chestnut tree outside the hall. "It's over then?" he asked. Miss Marple nodded. Delaney was not the killer, nor was Partridge. They were merely men trying to outlast the memory of themselves. Cray glanced at her. "Then who?" She looked up at the tree. "Sometimes," she said, "the truth isn't about who pulled the trigger, wound the spring. Sometimes it's about who allowed the music to play in the first place." She turned. "I'll tell you tomorrow." The next morning dawned with a cold clarity that seemed to sweep away the last shreds of the storm. The puddles had frozen slightly at their edges, and the trees stood bare and still, like sentinels keeping watch. In the hush that followed the chaos, the village returned to its routines, though quieter now, as if it too sensed that something long held in shadow had been brought into the light. Miss Marple arrived at the station just after 10, escorted by Charlotte Glenn, who looked pale but composed, the lines around her eyes set with purpose. Inspector Cray stood waiting in the interview room, the ledger Miss Marple had unearthed resting in the center of the table. "This is everything?" he asked quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "All of it. Ambrose's account, Wells's annotations, even Eleanor Vale's final letter tucked between the pages like a pressed flower. A record of guilt, yes, but also of cowardice." Cray opened the ledger. He had already read most of it. Still, the sight of so many names, so many entries, filled him with a quiet revulsion. The past, so often spoken of with sentiment, had teeth. Charlotte sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "I think I understand now," she said. "Not just what they did, but what they allowed." Cray looked up. "You said you didn't kill Dr. Wells. I believe you. But you knew, even then, that something was buried in that music box." Charlotte's voice was steady. "Yes, I suspected my uncle had hidden something, but I thought it was petty. A will, perhaps, something to do with inheritance. I didn't know it was all of this." Miss Marple's voice, soft but unwavering, cut through the quiet. "What you felt that night, Miss Glenn, wasn't just grief. It was the pressure of a truth you weren't ready to face. You weren't alone in that." Cray leaned forward. "The problem is, the truth doesn't point us to a killer. At least, not directly. No fingerprints, no confession. Only a chain of decisions, half of them made decades ago." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "But Inspector, I think you've misunderstood the nature of the crime." She reached into her handbag and produced a smaller notebook, her own. On the first page, in her neat hand, was a timeline: the arrival of Wells, the auction, Charlotte's reaction, George's panic, and, finally, Delaney's quiet return. What Marcus Wells threatened wasn't exposure. It was destabilization. He believed he could leverage their shame. He wanted to force a confrontation, but he underestimated how fragile the whole web had become. Cray frowned. Then who struck the final blow? Not a blow, she said. A decision. She turned to Charlotte. May I? Charlotte nodded, eyes cast downward. Miss Marple looked at Cray. Wells was poisoned. Not violently, not with something theatrical, with something slow arsenic, I should think. A few careful doses over several days, enough to disorient, to weaken. Cray's eyes narrowed. We didn't find arsenic at the cottage. No, Miss Marple agreed, because it wasn't given there. It was likely added to something habitual. Tea, perhaps, or a tonic. Charlotte's breath caught, barely audibly. Miss Marple didn't look at her. You see, Spectre, the one person no one questioned, was the one person who never left the story, who carried it every day, in her home, in her routines, in her tea. Now she turned to Mrs. Phelps, the housekeeper. Cray stared. The housekeeper. She served Ambrose Glenn for 30 years. She knew everything. Heard everything. The others were involved in hiding the truth, but she watched the consequences, watched Eleanor Vale decline, watched Ambrose drink himself quiet, and when Marcus Wells came back, she must have seen it in his eyes what he meant to do. Charlotte whispered she'd never liked him. She feared him, Miss Marple corrected, because she knew he would bring it all down. Perhaps, she even believed she was protecting you, Charlotte. Cray stood slowly. We'll bring her in. Miss Marple nodded. Gentle. She didn't kill out of rage. She killed because she thought no one else would act. That evening, as the sun set in long, gold fingers across the lane, Miss Marple sat with Charlotte beneath the chestnut tree, where the first crack in the story had formed. You've been very brave, she said. Charlotte looked out at the quiet street. It doesn't feel like bravery. It's just the end of pretending. Miss Marple reached for her knitting. Sometimes, dear, that's the bravest thing of all. They sat in companionable silence as the sky deepened into dusk. The air filled not with tension, but with something else, something like peace. But Miss Marple knew better than to call it closure. No village ever forgets its secrets. It only folds them away neatly, like old linens, until the next storm arrives. The days that followed settled over St. Martin's like a soft blanket. In the village, ever eager to return to gentler rhythms, began to resume its familiar rituals. The tea room reopened. Seed cake reappeared in its usual prominence, and the vicar's wife resumed planning the church fete, this time with a renewed sense of urgency, as if distraction could somehow sew up the rift left behind. But beneath the pleasantries, there remained a subtle tautness, as though the village itself was still listening for the last word in a conversation it hadn't meant to overhear. At the police station, Mrs. Phelps sat quietly across from Inspector Cray. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, the very picture of composure. She had neither denied nor confirmed Miss Marple's theory, merely tilted her head and murmured, he was going to ruin everything. Some things are best left buried. Cray had not pressed her. He knew well enough the weight of silent wars, fought behind kitchen doors and drawn curtains. There would be no trial. The Crown Prosecution Service would never pursue a case built on inference and sentiment. Not when the woman in question was nearing 70. The victim, a man already steeped in blackmail and buried secrets, was hardly sympathetic. And, perhaps, Cray admitted to himself, justice didn't always come in courtrooms. Miss Marple spent the morning in her garden, trimming back the climbing rose along her trellis. She moved with the familiar ease of someone who had restored order, though not without cost. She had received a note from Inspector Cray that morning, short, respectful, and ending with the words, "Thank you. I hope the village can rest again. Rest, perhaps. Forget." Never. She snipped a final stem and turned to find Charlotte Glynn standing at her gate, a slim parcel tucked under her arm. "I thought you should have this," Charlotte said, stepping forward. It's what's left of the music box." "What wasn't broken?" Miss Marple took the parcel gently. Inside was a curved section of the mother-of-pearl lid, still gleaming faintly in the morning light. The melody bar bent, but intact rested beside it. Charlotte gave a small smile. "Seems fitting, doesn't it?" The tune never finished. Miss Marple returned to smile, eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes it's better that way. Some songs are meant to haunt, not to soothe." They stood for a moment, quietly acknowledging the space between them, what had been lost, what had been uncovered, and what could never be reclaimed. Then Charlotte added, almost as an afterthought, "Did you know? My uncle once said the music was composed for a child who never lived long enough to hear it." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Yes, dear, I suspected. Grief takes many forms. So does atonement." Charlotte turned to go, and Miss Marple watched her walk down the lane, her posture straighter than it had been in weeks. Some burdens, when shared, no longer stooped the shoulders so deeply. That afternoon, Miss Marple joined Mrs. Bantry for tea beneath the arbor at the back of the Bluebell Inn. The wisteria had begun to bloom early, delicate violet clusters framing their view of the green dot. Mrs. Bantry leaned in conspiratorially. "I hear the postmistress thinks it was all over a love affair. Says Wells was in love with Eleanor Vale and Ambrose wouldn't allow it." Miss Marple sipped her tea. An excellent theory, I'm sure, though I do find it curious how love is so often blamed for the things ambition and guilt tend to orchestrate." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "So it wasn't love?" "Oh, I think love was there. It's not the kind that makes people better. More the sort that asks to be paid back with interest." Mrs. Bantry sat back with a sigh. "Well, I suppose we shall all pretend to move on now until the next scandal breaks." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their steady click. "That's the way of things, my dear. Villages remember, even when the people forget." The two women fell into companionable silence, the sort that only comes after a storm when the air is still heavy. But the worst has passed, and though the sun shone warmly through the arbor, Miss Marple felt, as she always did, that something remained, small thread yet to be pulled, because every soft mystery leaves behind one unanswered question, and sometimes the most unsettling ones are those no one dares ask. 2 weeks had passed since the last ripple of Dr. Marcus Wells's death had faded into the gentle rhythms of village life. The auction was spoken of fondly again, if cautiously. Charlotte Glynn had resumed her visits to the Vicar's garden committee, and Inspector Cray had returned to the steady cadence of more ordinary cases: stray dogs, missing bicycles, the occasional dispute over garden hedges. But Miss Marple, as was her habit, remained observant, not because she doubted the outcome. She rarely did once her mind was settled, but because there was a difference between solving a mystery and understanding it, and there was one small matter that had troubled her still. It arrived in the form of a letter, delivered quietly, left without a stamp or postmark, folded into a pale blue envelope, and slipped through her front door early one morning. "Dear Miss Marple, thank you for what you did. You saw more than most would, and understood more than I expected. But there is one part of the story you never said aloud, and perhaps chose not to. I'm writing now not to confess, but to confirm, because I believe you already know. It was not Mrs. Phelps. She found the ledger. Yes, she knew what it meant and what it could destroy. But she did not poison Marcus Wells. I did. You once said people kill not just from anger, but from fear. You were right. I feared what Marcus would do to my family's name, my uncle's shame, my sister's ghost, the things that would rise again if the ledger came to light. But more than that, I feared what would happen to me not the law, the silence, the loss, the truth that I had allowed everything to be built on lies and done nothing. When I put the arsenic in his tea, it felt terrible, but also final. I thought I was ending something. Now I know I only opened it. I will not run, nor will I confess. I will live with what I did. That, I think, is the greater punishment. Charlotte Miss Marple folded the letter once, neatly, and placed it in the top drawer of her writing desk. She was not surprised. She had suspected the truth. Since the night of the auction, the fury in Charlotte's voice had not been performative, had been personal. Not performative rage, but a silent dread that the past would rise up and unravel. Everything she had tried to protect, Mrs. Phelps had known, of course, and had protected Charlotte in the only way she could, by stepping into the shadow willingly. Miss Marple had let it be so. There are, after all, truths that solve the mystery, and others that solve the soul. Outside, a blackbird chirped from the ivy. Miss Marple rose, selected a clean teacup, and carried it out to the garden where the crocuses were just beginning to bloom. That afternoon, the churchyard, Inspector Cray met Miss Marple beneath the great elm by Eleanor Vale's grave. The air was quiet, full of green scent and birdsong, as though the land itself had exhaled. "Funny thing," Cray said, adjusting his collar. "It never ends exactly how you think it will." Miss Marple smiled gently. "No, real stories rarely do. They don't resolve so much as settle." He studied her for a moment. "If I asked you plainly, do you believe Mrs. Phelps did it?" Miss Marple met his eyes. "I believe she carried the burden of many people's sins, and in doing so, perhaps spared them from greater consequences." "That's not quite the same as yes or no, Caney," she agreed. "But sometimes, Inspector, certainty is less important than mercy." Cray nodded slowly, then turned his gaze toward the headstones and Charlotte. Miss Marple reached into her bag, withdrew a single crocus bulb wrapped in cloth, and crouched to plant it at the edge of Eleanor Vale's grave. "She has planted something new," she said quietly. "Let us hope it grows straight." As dusk fell across St. Martin's, the shadows grew long and golden. And the village, in its age-old way, closed its curtains against the coming dark. There were no more whispers, no more knocks at midnight, only the sound of evening birds and the low hush of wind through the trees at East Hollow and in the small cottage on Church Lane. Jane Marple added the final line to her notebook. "Truth is not always about justice. Sometimes it is about grace." She capped her pen, folded her hands, and listened to the quiet. There would be other mysteries, of course, but this one had ended, not with arrest, not with confession, but with understanding, and in the stillness that followed, she heard only the soft click of her knitting needles and the faint echo of a lullaby never quite finished.